Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 150, A Bawdy Twelfth Night, a conversation with Rachel Aanstad. For this very appropriately timed guest episode, which is released on the 6th of January, Rachel Aanstad kindly agreed to come onto the podcast to talk about the Elizabethan Twelfth Night traditions and Shakespeare's play of the same name. As you will hear, our discussion became very much more wide-ranging than that, as is often the way when we talk about Shakespeare. Rachel's close study of the play came about not only because she has written on the play in her book A Bawdy Twelfth Night or What You Will, an Encyclopaedia and Dramaturgical Handbook, but because she has directed productions of the play. You will hear more on both those subjects as part of our conversation. Rachel Aanstad is a writer, artist, historian and self-confessed Shakespeare nerd. She has an MFA in theatre and is the former artistic director of the Rose City Shakespeare Company. She lives in the Pacific Northwest, from where she writes books about Shakespeare's plays and is currently writing about Shakespeare's influences for Pen and Sword, which will be published in 2026. I spoke to Rachel from her home over a Zoom call. So we know that the first recorded performance of Twelfth Night was on the 2nd of February 1601, which is in fact the Feast of Candlemas, when it was performed at the Middle Temple. But given the title of the play, there seems little doubt that it would have been performed at the court the previous Christmas. So perhaps the best place to start would be, can you tell us something about the Christmas celebrations at that time of year and get us into the mood?
You bet. So Christmas in the Elizabethan era was in some ways kind of a confusing time, because the calendar that the Elizabethans were going by was not the same calendar as much of the rest of Europe was going by. So the Elizabethans were still going by the Julian calendar, and in Rome and other parts of Europe, they were going by the Gregorian calendar, which had been founded by Pope Gregory, but the Anglican bishops didn't want anything to do with anything that Pope Gregory said, and so they held on to the Julian calendar in spite of the fact that it was not as accurate as the Gregorian calendar. And so what that meant is that in England and some other parts of Europe, and even in some parts of the world today, like Armenia, they celebrated Christmas on January 6th and 7th. And the rest of, Catholic Europe was celebrating it on the 25th of December, the way we do now. Right. And so there was this sort of, not exactly, I don't want to say no man's land, but this kind of liminal time in between December 25th and January 7th, when anybody you met might or might not be celebrating Christmas at that time. And so the festivities tended to start in December, sometimes, even earlier, of course, than December 25th, and go on until the beginning of January. Now, this corresponds also to the Roman holiday of the Saturnalia, which was a time when taboos were lifted in terms of social interactions. And the servants would be served by their masters, a fool, or in some traditions, a boy bishop. After this was Christian, obviously, but a boy bishop would be appointed to rule over, and they would have to do whatever that boy bishop said. And so there's this long tradition, centuries-long tradition of this solstice time of the year, when the days are short and the nights are long, for people to let down their hair, kick up their heels, drink, party, and move beyond their normal, very rigid social classes. So, but to get kind of more specifically to what the Elizabethans were doing during this time of year, they were doing lots of singing, dancing, performances, plays, lots of games, pranks, They would give each other presents. It was a popular time of year to get married. And in the Elizabethan court in particular, it was a time to give Elizabeth presents. Interestingly, a lot of times what people would do is, in order to avoid the appearance of kissing up to the queen, they would dress in an elaborate costume and they would show up as a fairy or a elf from beyond the woods, and they would say, "Oh, no, no, your majesty, that was not me giving you that gift. That was, the elf of the woods or whoever was." An important tradition was wassailing, where people would basically drink it's called lamb's wool, and it was a combination of, some fermented beverage like ale mixed with kind of a hot apple cider. Sometimes it was just alcoholic cider with some bread mixed into it and possibly some other nuts or something like that. It was kind of a meal in a cup that could loosen the throat and got people to sing. And part of the point of wassailing, or people singing from house to house, was that it gave the poor a respectable outlet for begging at that time.
Because begging was frowned upon, generally speaking, wasn't it?
It depended, of course, where you were and, of course, who you were. But the church kind of relied on donations from everyone during this season. And so it was a way for people with not a lot of money to give money to the church. So it was sort of understood that this was a kind of holy performance almost, in that they would go around, they would sing these carols, they would get money, and then they would go and contribute to the masses being held. I'm sure they also ate some of that too. It wasn't all going to the church, one would hope, but it provided a little redistribution of wealth in kind of a festive way.
So back with the court, everyone's in a very happy mood. The Queen has hopefully enjoyed all of her presents. Obviously, presenting a play as part of Christmas celebrations became a tradition really from quite early on in that period. And Shakespeare comes up with Twelfth Night, clearly a comedy, many would say his funniest, appropriate for Christmas, but not a Christmas play in itself.
I disagree. I think it is a quintessentially Christmas play because it addresses what happens when you rearrange those social roles, what happens when you make those topsy-turvy. And in addition to all the other festivities around Christmas time and the Saturnalia, it was a time when the fool would take over and run the proceedings. And when you know that and read the play, you realize that it is Feste who is driving all the action forward. It is Festes who is in charge. It certainly isn't Olivia, definitely not Toby, obviously not Orsino. So who really is in charge here? And we see Feste almost from the very beginning of the play deciding what happens when.
Right, so someone in the contemporary audience would have picked up on that reversal of social status, and as you're suggesting there, is driven by particular characters who are not the ones you might expect to be driving the plot.
Exactly.
And then, of course, we have the reverse happening with Malvolio, because he is trying to elevate himself, but actually kind of has the opposite effect on him as he ends up in prison.
Yes, and even Malvolio's attempt to elevate himself is part of upending that social order. He has decided that the young woman who he helped raise is somebody that he should be able to marry when he should be her servant and her protector. And he has turned that all upside down in his head into thinking that he should be able to marry her, bed her, and elevate his own social status.
And of course, by the time Twelfth Night comes along, there is beginning to be some movement in social status within society towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, and then later into James. There is, merchants who are becoming successful and wealthy, landowners who are no longer the traditional landowners from the gentry, but have managed to buy into that whole system. So I wonder how much that Malvolio trying to raise himself up also resonated with the audience at the time.
Well, it could be, but to be fair, that social order had been shifting for some time. So we can go back in time to the 14th century and look at when a handsome Welsh servant, Owen Tudor, to Catherine of Valois, the Queen of England, caught her eye, and she fell in love with him and married him and had 2 children. And, the result is the entire Tudor line. And so, in a sense, it is hearkening back to Elizabeth's own ancestors for Malvolio to have these kinds of aspirations. The problem is that Malvolio is evidently not as charming as Owen Tudor was. And
nowhere near, I suspect.
Nowhere near. And also, again, I think it's really important for us to remember that Malvolio helped raise Olivia. He's much older than her. And I get into discussions about Malvolio a lot with people because people feel sorry for Malvolio, which I understand. Any empathic person should feel sorry for someone in prison. Nonetheless, he was defying not only a number of social conventions, but he was also creeping on a young woman that he helped raise. And when I realized that definitely changed my perspective on how I felt about Malvolio.
Yes, certainly there have been some very comic performances from Malvolios over the years, but I think you could absolutely play into that kind of whole creepy aspect of that relationship.
Well, humor and creepiness often go together, so I don't see the conflict there. I loved Stephen Fry's Malvolio. He did a wonderful job, I thought.
Yes, and that is an interesting production, isn't it? Because it really centers on Olivia a lot more than others do, I think.
It could be. I think it was an outstanding Olivia, I think was part of it. And, no slam on any actor. It's a very difficult role. But to bring Olivia to the surface as sort of more than a cipher, as more than a stand-in of an inamorata, as more than kind of a young woman in love and in trouble, I think that takes a lot of skill.
Are there any other versions of Twelfth Night that you would particularly pick out as memorable?
Oh gosh, as someone who had a Shakespeare company, of course, my own actors are always my favorites. There's a version with, I think, Paul Rudd and Helen Hunt in it that I'm a Shakespeare director. I quibble with every production. Don't take it personally. Yeah. So, there's things about that production, like they rearrange the order of the scenes, which always annoys me. But I just thought in general, it was a fun production to watch.
Obviously, you're immersed in Twelfth Night and you're there partly, you're a theatre director, but also you've written a book, which is more than just a critical study of the play, I think. I mean, I found it very entertaining and very interesting as well. It's called A Bawdy Twelfth Night, or What You Will, and it's subtitled An Encyclopaedia and Dramaturgical Handbook. So I can see it would be useful for many different sorts of readership. Perhaps you can tell us what you were thinking when you put it together and what you were hoping it would achieve.
Well, as somebody with both an academic and theater-making background, what I find when I go into spaces to talk about Shakespeare is they tend to be filled either with academic scholars or with theater makers, and rarely do the twain meet. And they both have a tremendous amount to learn from each other, but they're really hampered by different vocabularies, different ways of approaching the material. And, I'm sorry to say that both sides tend to look down on the other. And I understand this. As a theater maker, when you produce Shakespeare, you are living the play, you are inside the play, and that gives you a perspective that no amount of close readings can ever give you. On the other hand, for the academics, they've read so deeply and so widely that they know things about the play that the theater makers rarely have time to find out. They're too busy making theater.
Mm.
And so both come up with all of these treasures and insights. And so when I was producing Twelfth Night myself, I was really frustrated that I couldn't just find a reference book that had all the things I needed in it, both from theater makers and from academics, for me to produce an informed version of the play. And so, like all writers, I wrote because I wanted the book and nobody else had written it. And so here it is. As a result, because it's a kind of book nobody else has written, academic publishers don't know what to do with it. It's not necessarily an academic monograph in that sense. And it's also not just an annotated script. It falls somewhere in between. But I loved writing it. I was kind of sorry when I was done with it and had to move on. But you have to finish writing these books or you can't publish them.
Yes, you do.
Here we
You're
are.
right. I should point out it includes the whole of the play in there. It's heavily illustrated and has an enormous glossary in it of terms, which are, again, nice and easy to pick out. You're not looking at tiny footnotes at the bottom of a page. This is a devoted section where you pretty much take, well, any word that I think you might think people would find difficult to understand or has multiple meanings, and do a short analysis on it, often with a amusing illustration as well. Was there anything that you found in the play that really surprised you when you went through it that closely?
Well, there were quite a few things. And I do want to mention that one of the reasons that I illustrated it is because of the way people learn. When we have an image that we can attach to a word, that makes it much easier to memorize. And in a sense, this was the impetus for the beginning of the whole book, in that I wanted to provide a glossary that anybody from any language background could look at and go, okay, I know what that is. That's a curtain. Hamlet calls it an arras, but I see this picture now that it's a curtain. There were a lot of things, of course, that I discovered as I was writing, which is the fun of writing a book like this. One of the most interesting things is that Maria is often depicted as being of a lower social order than Olivia, as a genuine servant, as a maid, as the way we think of as a maid today. But in Shakespeare's day, Maria would have been the same social class as Olivia, because nobles didn't talk to people of a lower class than themselves. They had other people talk to them. And so Maria might have been charged with talking to the cook, or Malvolio might have been charged with talking to the cook, and so on. But Maria herself should be certainly, gentry, if not nobility. And I feel that that imparts a dignity and also an understanding of why Maria felt justified in punishing Malvolio. Malvolio is her social inferior, and he is treating her as if she was his social inferior because she's a woman. And so this adds another layer to all of the fun kind of gender experimentation and play that happens in this text. Let's see. Feste, I love Feste. He's one of my very favorite Shakespeare characters. And Feste says a number of things that sometimes scholars, they don't necessarily know what it means, and they say, oh, he's just talking nonsense. However, Feste never speaks nonsense. At one point, he's talking about how he can't buy ale from the Myrmidons. Feste says, the Myrmidons are no bottle ale houses. And what the heck does that mean?
Mm.
Why would a Myrmidon, ancient Greek mythological tribe, have no bottle ale houses? Okay, well, first of all, let's break this down. A bottle ale house is a place where you can buy ale. You can buy it by the bottle, take it home. And a Myrmidon was an ancient Greek tribe that got turned into ants. Now, ants, according to Pliny and others, made beer. They stole grain, they fermented it, and what do you get when you have fermented grain? You have ale.
Mm.
And so Festi is complaining that he can't buy beer from the ants, even though he knows they're making it.
So I see what you mean. Sounds like nonsense, but actually makes perfect sense to anyone who understands the reference.
To understand the reference. And so many of Festi's references are classically based, in Pliny, in Ovid, and so on.
Mm.
And we think that part of that is because Festi was played by Robert Armin rather than Will Kemp, who had kind of a more physical comedic style.
Yeah.
But Robert Armin was educated, and Robert Armin was a goldsmith. And the goldsmiths had a very prestigious guild. In other words, the goldsmiths were kind of the highest level guild you could have. And back then, guilds used to have a lot of kind of esoteric rites associated with them, which came down to us through the Freemasons and so on. So Robert Armin here is showing off, and Festi is showing off about his classical education. And it's kind of in a way, a kind of an intellectual shibboleth, right? They're sort of testing the audience. Okay, if you laugh at this joke, then we know how educated you are.
Right.
And if you don't laugh at the joke, or maybe you do just because it sounds silly, just because you don't know what it means, then it's funny. And so this is, for me, really the genius of Shakespeare, is how he writes on so many levels at once and can appeal to so many different audiences with the same line, and they may all be getting something different out of it. So when I began doing a close reading of Twelfth Night, I was trying to be open-minded about Antonio and Sebastian, and do they have a queer romantic relationship? And I have to say, after going through line by line, looking for the body meanings of every word, that in my opinion, it is unquestionably yes. They are in love. Antonio has every right to be expecting romantic commitment from Sebastian, who has apparently been his lover for several months. And I think Antonio he becomes the demonstration of what real love looks like. Real love is selfless. Real love is generous. Real love, unfortunately, will sometimes pursue someone even when they don't appreciate us. And so a big heartfelt shout out to Antonio.
I found the section on the concept and reality of Illyria really particularly interesting. So maybe you could take us through some of your thoughts on what that setting meant to the contemporary audience and what people's understanding of somewhere called Illyria really was.
Yeah, I'd love to, because when I began studying this play many moons ago, the consensus was that Illyria was an imaginary place. And this is simply not true. Illyria was a real place. It existed during the ancient Roman times, and it occupied a lot of what is Croatia now, and was originally a Venetian culture. And so I started looking into, when you're doing a glossary, you have to look up the meanings of these words in other languages and try and get some of the puns. Now, obviously, I could not get them all, but I was wondering if there were any Venetian words in there that added to the meaning of the play. And sure enough, the word viola in Venetian means fart.
Okay, I hadn't heard that one before.
in a play with characters named after burp and fever, then it's hardly
Mm.
surprising that Shakespeare would throw in a little fart joke. There's a town in Croatia called Dubrovnik, which used to be Ragusa. And at one point, the Venetians had settled Ragusa, like a lot of the Adriatic coastline there. But Ragusa had fought back and had thrown off the yoke of the Venetians and allied themselves with the Ottoman Empire in order to protect themselves from the Venetians. Well, at the time that Twelfth Night was likely being written and first being performed, there was an ambassadorship from Ragusa in London trying to negotiate with Elizabeth because there had been some political kerfluffles between the two countries, and the Ragusans were doing the best to smooth that over. But there are some interesting associations with Ragusa than Illyria in a legendary sense, in that because of their association with the Ottomans, they were thought of as having some of that Ottoman influence. And there are some fascinating books on the topic. There's a wonderful book by Jerry Broughton. It's published as This Orient Isle in the UK and The Sultan and the Queen, The Untold Story of Elizabeth and Islam in the US, where he goes into a lot of really fascinating detail about the Ottoman and Islamic influence on Elizabethan culture. And all of this would have come right through Ragusa on its way into London. And so I sometimes wonder if Olivia's insistence on an all-female household has some connection to the idea of an all-female harem from the Ottoman Empire. And, this is something that some grad student could, if they were so inclined, undertake. But these are the kinds of questions that, reading these texts with an open mind of saying, instead of agreeing with everybody else and going, oh, well, Illyria is clearly an imaginary place, instead of going, well, but what if it's not an imaginary place? And finding out what else it could be. And I want to emphasize that this is not my discovery that Illyria is a real place. I found this thanks to the hard work of many other scholars. But even today, much of Dubrovnik, or what was Ragusa, is still there. Now, they had to rebuild it. They had to rebuild the wall. Much of the town was devastated by an earthquake in the 17th century. Nonetheless, it is extremely likely that this was the original setting of Twelfth Night.
That's fascinating. And then you get into that whole question of where Shakespeare got his information from, as someone who probably didn't travel outside of England.
Well, and again, I feel like this is something that I feel is really important. I feel that as scholars, we need to have humility. We need to be able to say, I don't know. And the fact is, we do not know, we cannot know how well-traveled Shakespeare was. There are 10 years where we don't know anything about him. Most of the time, we can kind of keep tabs on, who was his landlady, where did he do this, where did he do that? But there's 10 years when he's suddenly not there. And we tend to think of travel as being this horrendously difficult thing, when the fact is that any young man with an inclination could hop on a ship and work his way, throughout Western Europe. It would only have taken, in good weather, 2 weeks, maybe 3, to get to Venice. And so I don't think that we can assume that Shakespeare either did travel or that he didn't travel. We have to just say, we don't know, but he sure knows a lot about sailing a ship. And he sure knows a lot about these different places. Now, did he alter the details? Did he get some of them wrong? Did he maybe have the wrong impression sometimes? Of course, he's a human being. But nonetheless, we cannot assume one way or the other. And all I am asking my fellow academics is to simply be comfortable with saying, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know how many languages he spoke. We don't know where he traveled to. We don't know any of that. And we can't prove it either way. And I suspect what has happened is that in the past there was a lot of bardolatry. People, put Shakespeare on this larger than life pedestal. And then, as we came into the 20th century and the 21st century, where we're like, whoa, wait a minute, he's not necessarily God's chosen playwright, no matter how much we love him. He's a man, he had limitations, etc. And so we've gone the other way to kind of bring him down to earth. And so I'd just like to suggest that he was an adult human of apparently relatively good health who had the same opportunities as other young men of his age and class, which included learning multiple languages and going to multiple countries.
My thanks to Rachel for her time and for sharing such insightful and detailed thoughts with us. The production of Twelfth Night that we mentioned is the Shakespeare Globe production, which starred Mark Rylance as Olivia and Stephen Fry as Malvolio. The production is available on DVD and well worth a viewing if you get the chance. Not only is it very funny, but the all-male casting in the replica of the Globe Theatre in London gives some really interesting insights into how Elizabethan theatre worked in that respect. Rachel Aanstad's book, A Bawdy Twelfth Night, or What You Will, an Encyclopaedia and Dramaturgical Handbook, is available through Amazon and is a wonderful resource for anyone who has more than a passing interest in Twelfth Night, whether your leaning is to the academic or the practical. I've put links in the show notes. Next time, it is back to Shakespeare, with a look at the play that probably vies only with Twelfth Night as Shakespeare's most popular comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. There's also now a Blue Sky account for the podcast if X is no longer your thing, so please give that account a follow there and say hi. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you can find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.